My name is Eleanor May Whitaker. I'm 34 years old, and I live in a cramped second-floor apartment above a laundromat in downtown Asheville, North Carolina. I work nights at a diner 3 blocks away. Coffee in my veins, fluorescent lights in my eyes, and I have a crooked smile that people tell me is adorable when what I feel is more like a bruise. Lately, my life has been a string of small, careful recoveries. From the drinking that nearly flattened me 3 years ago, from jobs that ended in goodbyes, from the way my body still remembers pain. My mother's voice is the one thread I have never been able to repair. Today, that voice did something I thought I might never hear spoken aloud in my life. It chose someone else instead of me. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The hospital smells like a combination of lemon disinfectant and something metallic I never learned to name. It's a smell that lives under your skin once you've spent enough nights on hard plastic chairs listening to fluorescent hums and low beeping. The room was too small for 3 people, and the light above the bed buzzed like an insect caught in a jar. Machines kept a steady, indifferent score of beeps. My mother, Ruth, was propped up on the bed with a splint of white bandage around her forearm, hair tucked into a hospital cap. Beside her, my sister Mara, taller, prettier, with the sort of clean jaw you could use to build a life around, was pale and trembling. She couldn't remember the name of the street we'd been on 5 minutes earlier. The doctor hovered by the door, his ID badge catching the light like something mechanical and human at once. "You need to decide," he said softly, as if decency would make the edges of the world less sharp. My mouth went dry. My legs buzzed like they'd run through cold water. I had been the one in the back seat, the one who shouted and grabbed the steering wheel when the driver swerved. I had thought for a strange, fragile second that maybe I'd finally done something right. That thought dissolved when my mother turned her face toward the doctor. Her skin was papery, her pulse a small surprise in my wrist as I took it. Her scent, cigarette smoke and cheap floral perfume from years ago, hit me, and I was a girl again, waiting for something to be different than it was. "Save my daughter," she said. The words were not urgent pleading but an order, a line carved into the air. The doctor's brow twitched. "Ma'am," he started. She pointed at Mara. "Save my daughter, not her." The room narrowed. The windows were a smear of gray. My name, Eleanor, looped and sank somewhere behind my teeth, like an anchor severed from its chain. "Ma'am, the doctor said, and then he put his hand on my shoulder like I might be glass. "We'll do what we can." But her eyes were on me, not pleading, not full of love. There was a peculiar, terrible certainty there. It was as if something had been decided long ago and finally revealed. The words dropped into me and sat on my lungs. It's not the first time my mother has chosen. When I was 5, she chose to leave me at my aunt's house and not come back for 6 months because it was a season. When I was 13, she chose to believe my father when he said I was bad, that I had asked for it. When I was 20, she chose Mara's college fund over my ability to see a counselor. The list reads like a ledger, payments she made on other people's lives. Mara's hand found mine. Her skin was ice, her fingers shook. She whispered, "Ellie, Mom," but it was a whisper lost under the mechanical beeps, and the doctor's face had the careful neutrality of a man trained to hold every family's catastrophe at arm's length. Later, in the darker hours when the visitors had filtered out and the night nurse had dimmed the fluorescent and the hallway hum became softer, I kept thinking about the 2 syllables in her sentence. Not her. Not me. The exact phrasing chased me. It wasn't "save Mara." It was "save my daughter, not her." There was ownership in her voice, as if she were guarding something private and deciding who was entitled to it. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. I didn't know then if those words were an accusation, a confession, or a final act of cruelty. I only knew that they landed, and that whatever had been brittle in me until that moment snapped into something with edges sharp enough to cut air. I could have lashed out. I could have grabbed her wrist and peeled the bandage from her forearm to make her look at me properly. But the room held more people than just us. The doctor, the nurse, the other hand at Mara's shoulder. I sat, transfixed, and watched the way my mother's mouth formed a sentence like an instrument she'd practiced for years. The night after that, in my apartment above the laundromat, I couldn't sleep. The machines down below made cyclical noises as if the world was washing itself of things. I replayed the scene in my head until it no longer felt like a memory but a film I had been forced to produce. I found myself telling the story aloud to no one, listening for how it sounded. Raw, small, accusing, inevitable. The words, not her, refused to let me breathe. The word daughter is supposed to be an anchor, something to tether you when the wind is too sharp. For my mother it was a weapon. I grew up with two types of daughter. Mara, who was the shape of a regular, acceptable life. And me, the unarranged, the mistake. I learned to recognize the glances that divided us. The quick, approving smile when Mara brought home straight reports, the way my praise was measured, as if it might break the furniture. My mother had her reasons, or so she told me once when I was 19 and raw. "You were never supposed to have that face," she said, fingers twisting the hem of her bathrobe. "You were never supposed to keep coming back." She spoke that way because there are truths that live like thorns, small, painful, and impossible to ignore. My father was not the man she married for the long haul. He was someone who left me with bruises I still catalog in the dark. And the person she called Mara's father was a teacher with a steady job and a trust fund that smelled faintly of lemon oil. The thing about secrets is that they shelter not only the guilty but the gullible, the people who need to believe in better stories. We were all small parts of a larger, uglier story. My mother was young and in love once, and within a year she was left with two girls. One she claimed, the other she resented. At night I'd lie awake and imagine the scene. A hospital corridor, a decision, a man in a suit shaking his head. That's the most tender thing about us humans. We invent reasons for the cruelty we endure, trying to make the cruelty make sense. When I was 18, Mara called me from the college dorm with a voice like silk. "Ellie, you should come visit. There's this study group and..." She left the sentence unfinished, but the subtext was a blessing and a curse. Blessed. My sister had a world and I was not in it. Cursed. She rarely asked me to be part of anything without an agenda, and I learned to read the spaces between words for the invitation that wasn't there. There are nights I can still feel the bruises like fossilized constellations across my skin, reminders of hands that told me I was too much or too little. One winter, when my bank account was colder than my apartment and I had to choose between groceries and a bus ticket to the town my mother lived in, I chose the bus. I needed to see her. I needed to ask the question I had been rehearsing since I was 12. Why? She lit a cigarette, and the ash fell like small apocalypses onto the floor. "You know why," she said. "It was a mess. You were a mess. You were there," I said. "You left. I had to survive," she said casually, as if survival warranted everything. As if the ledger of hurt could be balanced by small, illicit victories. My life after that was a slow suture. I got help, not because someone demanded it but because I woke one morning and realized I wanted to be available for myself. The healing was not a straight line. It was a series of collapses and rebuilds. I learned to cache my pain in small increments and buy my way into normalcy. A night class, a steady job, a therapist with compassionate eyes who never tried to rescue me. Each step felt like a fragile triumph. Yet even victories carry shadows. Winning meant making room for new grief, the realization that some doors in my life would never open. The accident that brought us to the hospital was, in a way, an inevitable collision of all the things we had refused to say aloud. Mara and I had been driving out to the lake after picking up my mother from a clinic. She had insisted on coming, though the doctor had advised no long rides. Mara was behind the wheel, my mother in the front passenger seat, me in the back. We were singing along to an old country song as if the chorus could rewrite our history. And then metal and glass and the sound of an animal being killed. I remember a spray of geese wings, another memory of old things taking flight, and the world folding itself into a single, terrible present. When the EMTs arrived, they treated us with the brisk efficiency of people whose work dissolves private pain into public facts. My mother was conscious, and her eyes were patchy with fever. Mara was quieter than I expected, hands fumbling. They took us in different ambulances, different rooms, different priorities. In triage they had to decide quickly who needed what. There were no dramatic movie moments, only the clinical arithmetic of trauma. "Save my daughter, not her," my mother said. It was not a line from a script. It was something sharper and more genuine. I remember the way the doctor's hand twitched. I remember how my blood went cold with the realization that the choice had been made long before any of us arrived there in our current mess. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. That night, I sat on a plastic chair in the hallway and pressed my forehead against a window that showed the hospital's parking lot. Empty, wet asphalt reflecting sodium lights. The emptiness felt like the exact shape of my life. I wanted to understand the logistics of her sentence. Why she would make such a blunt declaration in a room meant for the messy intersection of life and death. Was it a practical pleading? A statement of who she loved? Or was it a deliberate act of erasure? The truth of family is often less dramatic than betrayal and more like exhaustion. People make choices to preserve themselves, even if those choices ruin other people. In my case, that ruin had a name that fit in my mouth and a history I was only beginning to catalog. The days that followed blurred into the same two colors, antiseptic white and midnight blue. Mara's injuries were internal. She needed surgery. My cuts were superficial but thorough. They kept me overnight for observation because of a concussion and some bruised ribs. I was physically fine compared to the headline injuries, but there are bruises the scans can't show. There are decisions that are invisible to the body but cut the same. My mother stayed in the hospital, bolstered by morphine and a certain stubbornness. Her arm was a mess of stitches. The bandage around it looked like a poor excuse for containment. She had the sort of strength that is quiet and old. The doctor told us in a voice that attempted to balance empathy and protocol that they were constrained by a bed shortage and needed to prioritize post-op care. The implication was clinical, not cruel. If too many patients occupied key resources, someone would not get as intensive a recovery period. It was the kind of utilitarian arithmetic that lives in white rooms while making choices for messy human lives. "Ma'am," the doctor said again one morning, clearly aware of the edges between familial disputes and medical necessity. "If you have a preference for who we prioritize." She didn't take the bait. She didn't try to hide the truth. "Save my daughter, not her," she said. And this time there was no mistaking the identity of my daughter. She meant Mara. I remember the nurse's face folding into something like apology. "Sometimes families do choose to prioritize," she started, like a script pulled from a binder. But it didn't matter. The words were out. Later, in a quieter moment, I asked Mara if she really wanted my mother to be the center of her choices. She looked at me like I'd asked who she loved more. "Ellie, that's not even a question. Mom's my mom." Her voice had a brittle edge I hadn't heard before, a tremor of guilt and resolve tangled together. "You're okay with her saying not me?" I asked a foolish question because of course I knew the answer. I'd known every answer since I was old enough to watch them sit together at the kitchen table and feel like an intruder in my own life. "It's not about you," Mara said. "It's about the logistics. It's about recovery chances. Ellie, you need to stop making this into something it isn't." And there it was, the refrain I had been hearing all my life, the necessary reframe people would use to stop the messy truth from fanning into accusation. It was simpler to convert cruelty to practicality. It was easier to dress betrayal in practicality. That's how families survive. By compartmentalizing, by making a clean narrative that leaves out the messy stuff. When the surgeon finally came to speak to us, he moved with the slow efficiency of a man who had practiced grief management for years. "Mara's surgery went well," he said. "She'll need a few weeks to recover fully, but, my voice was too thin. "Her prognosis is good," the surgeon said. "Your mother, she's older, her regenerative capacity is lower. We must be more conservative with her care. There are risks with aggressive interventions." He said it like a mathematician, like someone trying to make figures out of feeling. I watched my mother's hands as she listened. They were small and work-hardened. The hands of a woman who had cooked, scrubbed, and negotiated small mercies for decades. She squeezed Mara's fingers and smiled with that thin smile she always used when a performance was required. I wanted to throw the truth like a grenade into the room. You didn't protect me before. Don't act like you're protecting me now. But what does a grown woman do with the impulse to break the last polite veneer? Instead, I did something worse. I became the patient spectator. I played my role with a kind of numb perfection that left me hollow and furious. If you're reading this and thinking I should have yelled, I understand. There is a part of me that also thinks the same. But there's another part, a smaller, quieter part, that knows that some roars come too late to change a lifetime. In the ensuing weeks, the hospital became a theater for small confessions. A social worker with an impossibly kind voice asked whether we wanted to discuss family notes about future care. Mara signed the forms with steady hands. My mother did not look at me. When she did, it was like a sun showing itself and immediately hiding again. I started to ask myself whether the cruelty was rooted in malice or in an ancient, default human survival instinct. My mother had always been good at survival. She had become a woman who could keep a household afloat on nothing but willpower and carefully rationed cigarettes. Maybe she saw an opportunity to guarantee Mara's future, something her own mother had never done for her, and she took it without thinking about the collateral damage. Or maybe she had made a cold calculation and there was hideous intention behind it. The ambiguity gnawed at me. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. There was a meeting one afternoon with a hospital ethicist who tried to temper our private feud with language meant to soothe. Families often make these decisions from a place of love, she said. But love can be messy. Love can be messy indeed. We all wrap our survival in soft phrases. We all tell ourselves stories about right and wrong until the story holds. In the end, I realized that the most honest thing I could do was to stop pretending this was merely practicality. It was something older, something that had started before any of us could name it. It was rooted in a small, bitter history that had never been addressed, in the ways my mother had measured us and decided what each of us was worth. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a hospital room empties at night, and you are left with someone who can still speak but chooses not to. I learned to listen to those silences, to the soundtrack of shallow breaths and distant pages. One night, around 3 a.m, the machines soft and persistent, I slipped back into my mother's room because sleep had refused me. Mara had been released home with a brace. She waved at me from the doorway as if I were a ghost she noticed in passing, and then went to sleep on a couch with a blanket pulled over her knees. My mother woke as if from a long sleep. Her eyes found me, and there was a clarity there I had not seen before. "Do you forgive me?" she asked, the question thinner than smoke. I wanted to say yes and mean it. I wanted to fix everything with a conjured absolution. Instead, I sat at the edge of the bed and told her the truth I had carried like a secret code my whole life. I told her about the nights I lay awake cataloging the ways she had chosen differently. I told her about the times I had swallowed my hurt because there was nowhere else to put it. I told her about the years I spent trying to prove to her, and to the world, that I was not the mistake she seemed to think I was. She listened. Her breathing was steady, but her hand hovered near mine like someone who did not fully trust the weight of touch. "I didn't know," she said at last. The words landed like a small, clumsy apology. "I made choices I thought would keep us safe. I was scared." "You left me," I said. "You chose her." Over and over. "Why?" She looked at me like a woman carrying a map of small, terrible compromises. "You were wild," she admitted. "You were dangerous to the life I wanted. I wanted a life that wouldn't be judged. I wanted Mara to have things I didn't have." The words were flimsy armor for a truth that sounded like confession. It would have been too easy and dishonest to make this scene into a sudden catharsis. There was no miraculous absolution. Instead, there was a conversation that felt like excavation, each sentence dug out and set in the light to be examined. She confessed to things I had suspected, that she had been cruel, that she had made decisions based on fear and pride, that she had sometimes loved the idea of her children more than she loved the messy reality of them. "And yet," she said, voice breaking on something like regret, I would never ever choose to harm you. I'm not asking you to have chosen me in a way that erases everything, I said. I'm asking you to understand that when you said save my daughter, not her, it was a repetition of all the ways I'd already been erased. Her face softened, and she reached out and took my hand as if we were strangers fumbling for the same rope. I wanted to make sure one of you had a future, she said. I thought, foolishly, that if Mara was secured, at least part of me would be secure. She sighed. Maybe I thought that if she had stability, it would reflect well on me. The simple, honest cruelty of it made me ache. The logic was bracingly human. A woman trying to sow a better life for her family by picking the least risky thread. The problem was that those decisions were never only about logistics, they were about dignity, about who you deem worthy of being held when the world unravels. There were flashpoints, arguments and tears and rocks thrown through the quiet of our small lives. Mara, caught between her desire for her mother's approval and the guilt she carried like a weight, vacillated. She wanted to defend our mother and, at the same time, to step away from the pattern of choosing comfort over honesty. In the small conversations we had, two sisters in a hospital corridor with coffee that tasted like pennies, we began to untangle memories. She told me about things she had noticed as a kid, my mother's late-night letters, the way she would cut coupons and hide bills beneath the mattress. I told her about the nights I had learned to be quiet. I realized then that the choice my mother had made in that hospital room was less an evil plan and more a mirror of all the petty, desperate things people do to feel safe. It was cowardice, yes, but it was also fear. Fear of poverty, fear of judgment, fear of repeating a life that left you hungry. We couldn't change the past, but we could name it, which is sometimes the first step toward changing its hold on you. Mara and I began to talk more honestly, to admit the ways we had both been complicit. Me in withdrawing, her in accepting the easier narrative. The healing was not immediate. Sometimes it regressed into old patterns. Her quick defenses, my retreat into silence. But slowly, an uneasy truce formed that was more honest than everything we'd had before. I visited my mother daily after that, partly out of obligation, partly out of the childlike part of me that still wanted approval. We spoke of practical things, medications, follow-up appointments, because practicalities are often a safe place to start. She would tell me about small victories. Finding a book, seeing a nurse who had a kind laugh. Those small human things felt like balm for the old wounds. In the quiet, once or twice she would say, "I know I hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness." Nor did I give it to her like a gift. Forgiveness is not a light switch flipped to restore power. It is a long, deliberate process of deciding what will no longer be allowed to shape your present. I forgave her eventually, not because her hands were clean but because I wanted to be free of how heavy her choices had made me feel. Forgiveness, for me, became less about her and more about my own liberation. My mother died 2 months after the accident. It was not dramatic. No last-minute speeches, no miraculous reconciliations that made everything right. She slipped away like a page tearing quietly from a book. I held her hand. Mara sat on the other side of the bed with a blanket over her knees, eyes swollen, and a small, tremulous smile that held everything she could not say. In those final hours, the lines between us softened, not because everything was resolved, but because mortality has a way of shrinking the distance between people who have been holding endless grudges. At the funeral, people said the things you say. "I'm sorry for your loss. She was a brave woman. Ruth will be missed." They nodded, patted our shoulders, and handed us casseroles. Some of those people were strangers to my pain. Few were not. I noticed, with a small, private fury, the way our town tried to tidy up the narrative. The prodigal daughters reunited at the bedside, the mother who sacrificed everything. It was simpler to tell that version. It was kinder to everyone else. In the months that followed, life did something ordinary and miraculous. It simply continued. I returned to my job at the diner, my hands remembering the routine of pouring coffee and sliding plates. I took Mara up on an invitation to meet for breakfast one morning, and we ate pancakes in a booth that smelled like butter and syrup and the possibility of repair. We spoke in increments about bills, about therapy, about the small things that make up everyday survival. We argued too because old grooves are hard to break and we had both been shaped by the same hands in different ways. The line my mother had drawn, "Save my daughter, not her," stayed with me like a scar. It hurt in moments when kindness felt scarce, and it reminded me of the complexity of human motives. What would have been easier, I think, was to rage against her forever. That would have been righteous and straightforward. Instead, I chose something messier, to hold the hurt and sometimes to let it go. If you've gotten this far and these words resonate in your chest, consider sharing this story with someone who might need it. Sometimes the smallest echo saves us from feeling alone. What I learned more than anything is that people arrive in our lives already flawed, shaped by things they cannot fix. Parents are not gods. They are humans with small, often terrible limits. You can build a life defined by the way others abandoned you, or you can build one in spite of it. Mara and I chose the latter in fits and starts. We are still learning how to speak without sharpening each other's edges. We are still learning how to be sisters without assuming the roles that damaged us. The lesson I keep returning to is this: decisions made in panic or fear are not absolutes. They are moments. Naming them does not undo the harm, but it does give it a shape you can live with. I stopped wanting an apology that would fix everything. Instead, I wanted truth, and with truth came a strange form of peace. When I tell this story now, I have learned to breathe into the places it hurts. I have learned to separate my worth from the decisions of people who were too afraid to become better versions of themselves. I have found a life that does not hinge on the approval of the woman who once told a doctor, in a room buzzing with fluorescent light, to save my sister and not me. In the hospital room she chose. She did what she believed would keep some part of her life intact. She was human. She was cruel. She was afraid. I do not endorse the way she treated me. I have not forgotten. But I have chosen to carry my scars with a gentleness that refuses to let them become my identity. If this story touched something in you, an old wound or a new recognition, please leave a comment. Tell me your own truth if you're brave. We are all living in the aftermath of choices we did not make, learning slowly how to survive them with our hearts intact.